Eskow, there's a lot, of course, always going on with the American economy. We try to translate that into, first of all, understandable explanations, and secondly, wherever possible, actionable ideas. That's what we try to do on this program. It's what I try to do in my writing. It's what my next guest tries to do in his writing. I always appreciate reading him. Ryan Cooper is a national correspondent for TheWeek.com. He's also written for a number of other publications, including the New Republic and the Washington Post. And he is co-author of a new paper from the Public Policy Project on social housing, the need for social housing in this country. And that's a topic of great interest to me as well, because I've been working on a piece about big ideas to solve the housing crisis. And Ryan's new paper addresses that. It is, I think it's called the People's Policy Project, actually, but he'll correct me. And the paper is called Social Housing in the United States, co-authored by Peter Gowan and Ryan Cooper. And Ryan joins us now. So first of all, Ryan, thanks for coming back on the program.
Thanks for having me. My pleasure.
And secondly, People's Policy Project. That's Matt Brunig. He's been on the program as well. Runs that thing, right?
That's correct.
Okay, so I stand corrected, but now I get to repeat the name several times and plug it, which should make Matt happy. peoplespolicyproject.org is where you can find it. First of all, what was the inspiration, Ryan, for co-authoring this paper on social housing?
Just thinking with Matt about the kind of ideas we wanted to push, we thought this one was a good kind of first proposal for something where, your straightforward big government solution really does make a great deal of sense. It's not, the most radical type of proposal. There have been public housing projects in American history at many points, still some that exist today. But this, we thought, was a good sort of sweet spot between, radical policy and completely practical ideas that could help, solve the housing crisis in many cities.
And first of all, a lot of people don't realize how severe the housing crisis is. And secondly, it's funny, isn't it, how many ideas that were common in the United States of the 20th century, at certain periods of the 20th century, all of a sudden feel radical when you propose them today. But as you say, we've had public housing in the past. What we have now is essentially, as I see it, but correct me if you feel differently. First of all, we should talk about the scope of the problem as it exists now, which is severe waiting lines and homelessness and lack and inadequate housing, national tragedy. And secondly, what we have now, especially with the Section 8, the voucher systems and so on, we have a kind of neoliberal, semi-market-driven, semi-not solution. It's sort of like the thought process behind the predominant system of housing policy in this country right now seems to be murky and muddled and basically based on a lot of half-baked and flawed ideas. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so, I mean, as you say, the rental crisis in particular is quite severe. Something like just under a half of all rental households are what they call rent burdened, or paying 30% or more of their income in rent. And a significant fraction of that, roughly, I believe more than half of that population are severely rent burdened, are paying more than 50% of their income. And the thing to note about that is that the problem reaches way up into the the middle class and the upper middle class. people who are making into $75 to $100,000 and still paying 30% or more of their income in rent. So, our complex of housing institutions is definitely failing poor people the worst, but it's failing, a huge slice of the middle class as well. And a big driver of that, as you say, you have these assistance programs, which are heavily means tested and also very small, Section 8 vouchers. The USDA has a much smaller program as well. Then there's the low income housing tax credit to build affordable housing, various city level affordable housing initiatives. And all of those are just like, they don't even barely touch the majority of the very poor people who they're supposedly designed for, let alone the middle class families. The way that housing has traditionally been provided for the middle class is with home ownership subsidies, and what we've seen over the last decade or so is that system coming apart as well. I mean, this was the whole housing crisis, and then the foreclosure crisis after that. The home ownership rate dropped by about 6 points, and something like 9 million homes were lost as part of during the crisis. And so, a lot of people even now who probably could afford to buy a house have been scared out of the market. They feel like it's a risky investment. They don't want to touch it. There's just also with the longstanding trends of economic inequality, stagnating wages for the middle class, people just straight up can't afford to buy houses, even with the subsidies provided by the mortgage interest deduction and how the 30-year mortgage, which is created by government policy, did not exist before the New Deal. So that part of housing provision policy is sort of coming apart as well. A lot of people still own homes, but it's just increasingly impossible for younger people to, get enough of a down payment or to,
or to qualify for the loan, or to...
Yeah,
because we have now a situation also where for younger people, between student debt burdens and other burdens that they may have, and inadequacy of wages, long-term wage stagnation, which you mentioned, people don't qualify for the loans, the private sector loans that are the heart of the home ownership element of the equation. We have Black and brown communities that have been decimated by the collapse in housing prices and other factors, and so they are, a lot of people have been wounded by that and by the way that banks pushed loans and so on. So we basically have a system that, you make a great point, that is not only not working for the very poor and the poor, but is also failing the middle class. So first of all, what is social housing, and where does it fit into that, solving that problem?
Yeah, so we called it social housing or municipal housing to distinguish it from traditional American-style public housing. And the difference is that the types of projects that we're proposing would be open to pretty much everybody. You wouldn't have the way that it's done in cities like New York, where only poor people, for the most part, can qualify for one of the apartments. And the point is, as we've been talking about, that the housing problem is affecting arguably the majority of the population. The solutions that we provide should also be available to the majority of the population. So you would take, basically, starting with land that cities already own, or the federal government maybe, that could give to these places, and you would build public housing projects, and then you would have to allocate the initial ones by some sort of lottery at first, but you would say, if you're, for example, in a very expensive city, you could have maybe 1/3 of the units that are reserved for, poor people, 1/3 that are sort of, middle of the road, somewhat subsidized, and then 1/3 that's just a market rate, and anybody can apply for a spot. And the advantage of that approach is that, number one, you're providing the benefit across the board. In classic egalitarian fashion, people are living, near each other, kind of, cheek by jowl with economic and social integration. And then secondly, if you have non-poor people in the units, then you can charge them a higher rent, and that they could still afford, of course. And the projects will be much more fiscally sustainable than current public housing is. In New York, they have a maintenance backlog of something, into the, I think, over $20 billion worth of maintenance needed on their units. And so, you're bringing in a lot more revenue. And then finally, you also don't create, very concentrated poverty. And there are a lot of studies on that, showing how you have worse schools, more crime, more environmental damage. Just concentrated poverty is one of the classic social ills. And so you can just sort of define, since the government gets to say who goes in there, then you can allocate things, to have nice, the kind of, non-segregated communities in every sense of the word. Both economically, socially, racially, so that all parts of a community get a decent slice of the benefits.
And again, we're talking with Ryan Cooper, who is a national correspondent for TheWeek.com and co-author of the new paper on public housing for social housing for the People's Policy Project. And Ryan, the other thing that's interesting about this is that if you look back, first of all, it addresses all the issues, ills you describe, and if people have read Richard Rothstein's work, The Color of Law, and other, they know the extent to which these problems have been enormous in society, and the extent to which segregation has persisted and even worsened over the last 50 years. So all that is terrific, and I would add to it, if people remember the public policy, the bitter conflicts over busing to achieve integration, or public housing, the location of public housing that was dedicated strictly to the poor. There was there was the battle in Yonkers that was dramatized. Oscar Isaac played the mayor, I think, for cable TV. So you had these bitter fights over public housing as well. One of the advantages, I would think, of this approach is that it's voluntarily integrated, because the people who pay, who come in because the prices are market prices but attractive ones, or they're there. Everybody is, in a sense, there voluntarily. So you wouldn't have that kind of conflict, I would think, that we've had in the past over what people feel is an invasion of their neighborhoods, whatever the racist undertones or overtones of that may be. You wouldn't have that kind of backlash, hopefully, and every new housing project would be a mixture of people anyway. I mean, is that sort of getting at what you're trying to do here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it would certainly avoid, insofar as the racialized backlash is driven by the fact that you have city communities where the poor people are overwhelmingly black, and you're sort of like sticking little pockets of mostly black people in these very grim sort of Stalinist apartment blocks, and people feel like it's going to be just devastating for their neighborhood values or whatever. It would be much less concentrated in terms of the change. And I think just in a broader sense, it would be, so much of the backlash to welfare has been the perception that it's all poor people, poor black people who are too lazy to work, getting all the benefits. And it may be the case that you could diffuse a lot of that with the structure of these units being that, by definition, everybody gets a piece of it, and obviously you're not guaranteed, at least not at first, to get one of those units. But, the fact that any middle class person could also apply for them, and it's not just for, really desperate folks, I think probably would salve some of that.
Yeah, and I also, it brings it into the arena of something that's a public good, like public high school, like elementary school, like clean water. It becomes something that is available, or in this case, as you say, maybe not to everybody initially, but is potentially available to everyone, because all of us are citizens or participants in this society. And I really like that approach a lot. So thanks for doing that. And Ryan Cooper, you've written a few other things lately I'd love to talk to you about. So unless there's more to say about social housing that I neglected to ask, I'd like to maybe... Is there?
One more point I think it's worth emphasizing on this is that there's a sort of brewing fight between the a kind of anti-gentrifier leftists and the what you might call YIMBYs, the people who are more pro-development, and the obstacle that the YIMBYs are running into with they're saying, well, we just need to upzone, allow more private construction, et cetera, et cetera. The problem with that is that the marginal unit of housing, whenever somebody builds a new housing project in the private market, it's that almost all the units tend to be luxury units. Right. And that tends to drive up local rents, push people out. And that creates kind of the backlash that you see from, the more lefty types. But on the other hand,
from long-term community activists, people who represent the historical residents, whether it's here in Washington, D.C. in Anacostia, where our studio is, or whether it's in San Francisco, where basically everyone who isn't an overpaid Silicon Valley type is being driven out, all the communities essentially.
Yeah.
So,
but the thing the YIMBYs do have right is that whenever there's a big uptick in demand, it's important to, increase the supply of housing in some way. And the nice thing about the social housing is that you can target that new supply directly where it's most socially needed, which is to say, middle of the road units, things that aren't so big, no concierge service taking up tons of space. They're just like packing in the supply right where it's most necessary. And so I think it makes for a nice sort of almost a kind of third way, if you will, type of approach that can satisfy maybe both of these constituencies at once.
I think it's a great idea, but please don't use that phrase on this program. And I could just hear there's some listener out there right now when you said no concierge service who's saying, but who will feed my cat when I'm away? But no, I think it makes a lot of sense. So a city like San Francisco, for example, where now the go-to solution people are pushing, the YIMBYs, as you call them, which I assume stands for yes in my backyard, yes, Bill in my backyard, are saying, well, you should lift all zoning restrictions, height restrictions, everything else, the closer you get to public transportation, and that would do it. But that is still a private sector solution, so that's still. I'm sure you've seen those proposals. So then they say then you'll have adequate supply because the market will respond. People will build high rises all over San Francisco, everywhere there's a BART station or whatever. But this, aside from the questions of quality and so on, that would also, as a private sector solution, they would still tend to be luxury units, right? So publicly built housing along those lines would be easier to control and would probably be more and would be egalitarian and would not create that problem. Is that a fair?
Yeah. Well, and you wouldn't, the YIMBYs that say like, well, there's a lot of luxury housing, but you just, if you just saturate the market, like eventually, you'll hit all the market segments, and then these buildings will get older and they'll get cheaper as they get older. But there's just that interim period of maybe 20 years or something like that could, just take, if those processes work as they say they're going to work, it's just like everybody else, in these communities might just have to be cleaned out. And the advantage of the social housing, is like you can, skip that process. And then also you can add more units, because luxury units tend to be very huge and sort of sparse in terms of their, square footage and footprint. And so, you get more supply for your construction dollar too. These cranes and concrete and stuff, those aren't limitless resources.
Right. No, that's a great point. All right. Now can we pivot?
Sure.
Because I did want to talk about Amazon. It was a few days ago, but in current news cycles, that's like eons. But I always get frustrated with the logic of a lot of liberals or folks on the Democratic side who always assume that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, when it's possible to have more than one enemy and for them to be enemies with each other. And so what I'm driving at basically is Amazon. Trump went after Amazon, a couple weeks ago now, and argued that they were taking advantage of the post office and so on. They were a predatory company and ranted and raved about them. And in response, a lot of people, well, first of all, there was some legitimate pushback along the lines of Amazon's effect on the retail industry has probably cost Trump a lot of money in the real estate business in New York as retail prices for retail properties go down there. But that aside, a lot of people jumped to the defense of Amazon, which I immediately knew would happen because that's the dynamic nowadays. But B, just makes no sense at all because Amazon is a huge problem and needs to be treated as such. And I have to tell you on a personal note, Ryan Cooper, that I wrote something in 2014, I think, for Salon, suggesting that we regulate Amazon and Google and Facebook as public utilities. I'd never heard anybody suggest that before. Franklin Ford did about 6 months later, but people thought I was insane. Now people are talking about nationalizing them, breaking them up, all of which I think are ideas worth discussing. And I love to see how the conversation has changed. And of course, Mark Zuckerberg being brought before Congress, although that had its frustrations too in terms of what they didn't ask. But so you wrote a piece when everyone was defending, well, not everyone, when a lot of people were reflexively defending Amazon because Trump had attacked it. Your piece was headlined, "Why Dismantling Amazon Could Really Rescue Trump Country." So briefly, what's your thesis? Your thesis there?
Yeah, I mean, Amazon is kind of a stand-in for the broader trend of, increasing monopolization, economic concentration in this country, and the problem with that, as it regards the stereotypical Trump country, which is to say, poorer majority white areas in Appalachia and stuff like that, even though, arguably Trump country should be, east side of Manhattan too. Setting that aside, these are places which have really gotten the business end of neoliberalism over the past 30 years, and in terms of trade and in terms of just failing to enforce antitrust rules. The views of Robert Bork on that basically just invented this ridiculous kind of revisionist history of antitrust law to make it so that you can't enforce antitrust law anymore. That became bipartisan dogma. And the result was that you had companies like Amazon just rolling up huge sectors of the economy. And retail is one of the big victims here online. And they for example, Amazon back several years ago, they had a competitor for the diapers market. There's a company called diapers.com, and Amazon wanted to buy them, in a classic sort of oligopoly roll up, and they refused. And so Jeff Bezos just sold diapers underpriced for years, until they basically drove them out of business and forced them to sell to himself, to Amazon. And back in the old days, in the 1950s, that would be considered dumping, illegal business activity, and they could have been, sued or basically enjoined from pricing their products like that. Because, during the antitrust days, the whole idea, with along the lines of Louis Brandeis, is you're supposed to get your business competition to happen on socially positive axes. So if you have competition where people are just trying to drive each other out of business so that they can roll up the whole market and then just soak the consumer, that's not really great competition.
Well, leaving aside, first of all, Ryan, your use of the terms dumping and soaking for a diaper business, I'm going to let that pass. But no, you make a great point that there was an era in American history, a long era, many decades, where this sort of predatory pricing, which is in the end good for nobody. Yeah, for a few years, people get to buy diapers below market price, but in the end they pay more because the Amazon or whomever is a stand-in, in this case it's Amazon, will charge them what a monopoly provider charges, which is more. And essentially the entire business model of the Silicon Valley, and the one that is, with their interlocking boards and sharing the same venture capitalist investors and so on, go in, underprice, grab market share, drive other people out of business, whether it's Uber and Lyft and the taxi business, or Amazon in the book business and the diaper business, or whoever you have, go in, drive others out of business for a period of years, which is why Uber has such a huge market valuation despite still losing money, in the expectation that once everybody else is out of business, you can charge outrageously high prices, make up for your losses, underpay workers because there's no one else bidding for their services, and on and on and on. That's really what you're talking about, right?
Partly, because the other half of the equation, in the actual history of antitrust law, Congress was trying to satisfy a number of different objectives. And one of them was the fact that, in addition to people being consumers, they're also workers. Low prices aren't the only thing that exists in the world. Low prices are no good for somebody who has no money.
Right.
And so, one of the objectives to maintaining a competitive market was to allow new businesses to start up and, provide jobs for people and sort of, advance economic productivity over time. And then finally, to the point of Trump country, to spread the economic activity out across the country. If you have these sort of rules mandating fair competition, common carriage rules for shipping, to where, say shippers are not allowed to charge different prices to different people. One of the major objectives of that was to say, we don't want it to be where there's 10 big companies and every single one of them is located in either New York, DC, San Francisco, or, Houston or something. You want it to be that every region, as practical as possible, at least, gets a fair cut of the economic product. And by preventing economic concentration, that's one of those side objectives, is to say, for people, if you're an entrepreneur in like Buffalo or something, and you want to start an internet business that's going to compete with Amazon, you'd be a fool. You're just going to get, if you're successful at all, you're just going to get competed to death by Bezos, and you might as well not even try. And so, for these places that really have been, as a lot of economic data has shown, been left behind in the modern economy, regulating these monopoly providers or breaking them up, depending on the details of their business model, really could be a decent policy to, provide a share of economic product in both, and not just, it's important to emphasize, not just in, these white working class areas, but also in, minority heavy inner cities and other places that are even more left behind under neoliberalism than, Western Pennsylvania, everywhere.
I think it's a great point and a great addition to the conversation about what to do about these mega companies, and I think we need to keep that conversation going. I have an idea too, but I'm not ready to talk about it yet. But Ryan Cooper, national correspondent for theweek.com and co-author of a paper on social housing for People's Policy Project.com. Great work, and thanks for coming on the program and talking about it.
Thanks for having me.